Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Tom Venam Podcast. Now, this morning I had the great pleasure of talking to Mr. Jack Stanley. Mr. Jack Stanley is an expert on old records and American history and a lot of interesting stuff. And I was lucky enough to sit down with him on Zoom, and I had a good chat to him about some of the old records me and him both love. We talked about some of the early record labels that were out at the time, and a lot of interesting stuff relating to music. So, without further ado, here's my interview with Jack Stanley. Nice to meet you, Jack.
Hi, nice to meet you as well.
So, I guess I'll start with the first question I had for you. It was, when did you get into historic record collecting?
Okay, it's kind of an interesting thing because from my perspective, when I was born a number of years ago, 78s were still around.
Hmm.
And the thing is that we didn't really think much about them. And I had 78s as a kiddie records from my kiddie machine when I was
Yeah.
a little boy, and they were 78 RPM. Didn't think twice about it. But I went to the Edison National Historic Site in West Orange, New Jersey, on a school trip in 1964. And at that time, the factory was still working. And so the whistles were blowing and everything else, for breaks and whatever. And there was a fellow there that I thought was very old. He was probably much younger than I am at this point. Who sat there and said, well, the old man liked blah, blah, blah. And he put on a phonograph record. And that was such the most amazing thing I had ever heard because it was so different from what I had in the
Yeah.
way of 78, this Edison thing. And that kept into the back of my mind for a while until it was 1969. I was in school. And in those days, and maybe they still do, we were doing a little bit of show and tell. Someone would bring something in
Hmm.
that was of interest to them, and they would talk. I brought a bunch of pictures in of Washington's headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey.
Hmm.
Not exciting stuff. And some kid came up with a record, and he said he and his father had been fishing, and they hooked this record on their hook while they were fishing, and he thought it was kind of cool. And it's like everybody's like, wow, that's really wild. So I went to the kid and I said, I'll trade you all my Washington headquarters stuff for this record. And he said, sure. And so he took the Washington stuff. I took the record, and I've never looked back since.
Hmm.
It was the catalyst, and it was a crappy piece of junk record, and I've saved it.
Do you remember
Um,
what one is it?
this is it.
Huh.
I framed it
Is
because
it
it's falling apart. It's an
is it
acetate,
playable?
huh?
Is it playable? It looks pretty worn out.
Yeah, it is playable, but even if it is playable, what's on it isn't really very playable. It sounds like four drunks singing together, and they break up in the middle and stop, and one hiccups and does something else, and then they start singing again. And I guess after they listened to it, they threw it in the water and got rid of it. But I've saved it
Hmm.
all these years now. What, 55 years I've had that, and it's a piece of junk, but it's what started this illness, you might say.
Yeah. And was there anyone that could help you out when you were collecting back in the day?
No,
Oh.
no. First off, you have to look at the world back then.
Hmm.
In 1969, we were landing a man on the moon, but communication was a very difficult thing.
Hmm.
If you didn't know someone, you wouldn't know much about anything because everything was like kind of localized.
Yeah.
And um, I used to ask people, and they'd say, oh, that's very old. I mean, I played this record for a radio station and said, can you tell me how old this is? And they said, oh, it must be from 1900. Oh, it's probably from 1950. But but they didn't know,
Yeah.
and they were the experts.
Hmm.
And this hobby existed, but it really didn't take off. You got to remember, in 1969, a Berliner record was 70 years old. And there were lots of people around who looked at them as just old records, old junk.
Yeah.
It wasn't until like we get into the 1970s and into the 80s that it really starts to blossom,
Hmm.
this,
Yeah.
this hobby.
And do you remember around that time period when it started to grow? What
Yeah, yeah.
was that? Was that was it easier to find information? Was it easier to find records? Or did it become harder or what happened?
There were shops, there were record shops
Hmm.
that would have old records,
Yeah.
and you'd buy them, or you go to like the Salvation Army,
Hmm.
and they'd have old records. And what I did as a kid, I was kind of brash. I used to just go to people's houses and ring the doorbell and say, "You got any old records?" And they used to hand me these things, piles of 78s, because they didn't want them. It was old junk.
A lot of them are
And
worth a lot now.
yeah, but they didn't know it. I mean, think about what you have around you right now,
Hmm.
and think 50 years from now, will you have it, or will you look upon it as junk? You would have thrown it out, and then 50 years later, you discover it's kind of valuable.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You can never figure the stuff out.
Hmm.
You don't. You have to wait for, what catches. I mean, like, old phonographs caught on, but old stamp machines didn't. You know, and things like that were popular.
Yeah.
It's just by chance it happened, and I think a lot of it had to do with Japan.
Oh, how's
There
that?
was a big surge in Japan because the economy of Japan took off, and there were a number of people that started collecting phonographs. And they wouldn't collect a phonograph; they would buy a tractor trailer full of phonographs and records.
Hmm.
And while this was going on in this massive buying in Asia, the prices started to go up. This is what caused the prices to go way, 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 way up.
Hmm.
When you were paying $45 for a machine, and that was considered an awful lot. And then suddenly they were $300, and then 750.
Yep.
There was a time if I wanted to buy like an Edison standard cylinder machine, it would cost me like $750 for just a run of the mill, nothing too special cylinder machine.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
right now you could probably buy one for 200.
Yeah. Well, they've gone up. I mean, here in Australia, we barely had any cylinder machines or phonographs made here until about the 1920s. So the prices are even higher. You usually need to get them in from the US or the UK. So yeah, it's quite tricky here, but in the and the finding the right records, like I'm a fan of Billy Murray and um,
Yes.
Al Jolson and all those early recording stars. They didn't make those early records here in Australia or even in the UK until about the 1920s. So you usually have to look to the US and Canada and get them imported.
Let's see.
So
I I
they're
had an interesting experience. I went to New Zealand
hmm,
and I found a series of records and a machine. It was a gramophone and typewriter, which was the old Berliner company, and a number of really early records in New Zealand,
hmm,
and they were marked import. So I was wondering, I guess there was a small import industry in Australia, but it couldn't have been too much. But one
wow,
of the big stars of the old records was Nellie Melba, who's from Melbourne, and I'm surprised that didn't add to perhaps Victor's
yeah.
striving to sell their records.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I knew about Florrie Ford, who was from Adelaide, popular in the UK, but
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I guess if Victor and Columbia didn't put it out, then it just, in my mind at least, gets forgotten, and I guess it's remembered by people like you. But
Well, sure, some stuff, yeah. Well, I imagine as time goes on, you are a sponge at this point. You're
hmm,
going to learn lots of stuff, and before long, people will be talking to you and try to get all kinds of answers from you and your collecting and your work and your research.
hmm,
You know, it's the rite of passage as it goes. You know,
hmm,
I was where you were at one point,
yeah,
um, and asking a million questions,
yep.
but there wasn't anybody to answer them. That was the problem.
Hmm. Did your parents ever try and help?
No,
Oh,
they thought I was out of my mind.
oh, really?
Why do you want this junk? Yeah,
Hmm,
they looked at it as junk,
yeah. Just a lot of
and
people. When I guess when videotapes were going out, people looked at them as junk, but the prices for them, they're going up now, believe it or not.
videotapes.
Yeah, VHS.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, the problem with those things, they don't last.
No, they don't.
Yeah,
They're
they
a lot
will
of
they will eventually just go blank. But
yeah, that's true.
so can I reverse the pendulum here just a touch? What got you interested, if I may ask?
Oh, yeah, thanks for asking. Well, I've always been interested in older music, I guess I started off listening to the music that came out around my time when I was 6 or 7, and then I started getting interested in music from the 1980s when I was 8 or so, Michael Jackson and Prince especially. Then
Hmm.
I went back 60s, Beatles, 50s, you got
Okay. Yeah.
Elvis, Frank Sinatra, still like the 50s stuff and the 60s stuff. And then it just went back and back and back. I'll probably be in the Stone Age eventually. But
Yeah. I put on seatbelts at this point. Hold on.
but yeah, I
But
think
that's really cool. Full speed astern, you know?
yeah, well, I think the first early acoustic artist I think I ever heard of was Billy Murray. And that's just because he was so big. Well, he made so
Yeah.
many records. Like you'd be, oh, well, maybe not hard pressed, but it's if there was a popular song that came out, you could bet it was pretty likely that he'd be doing a recording of it on one label or
Oh, yeah.
another. So
Sure. Yeah.
yeah, I don't
You
remember
know,
the
an
first song
interesting thing about Billy Murray
yeah,
is that unless he was under a contract, like he was under contract with Victor as an exclusive artist for a while.
yeah,
But for many years earlier on, he wasn't. And so, they would do, if you go to New York City in those days, on Fifth Avenue would be all the various studios for all the various record companies. And you just go from studio to studio and studio, and you do the same song.
yeah,
And and you'll find that so often you'll see the same song on so many different labels.
yep.
And these artists, and the two that made the most records were Billy Murray and Henry Burr.
Oh yes, yep. Henry Burr.
Um, Henry Burr is perhaps one of the early examples of someone who didn't use his real name.
Yeah, it was Harry McClaskey, correct?
Yeah, yeah, and he used a couple of other names.
Mm-hmm.
There was also the fellow named Harry MacDonough.
Yep.
That wasn't his name either. It was
Oh.
John McDonald,
Hmm.
and he was eventually an executive with the Victor Company. Uh,
Mhm.
and
Well,
he went from in front of the horn to behind it, as it were, you might
yeah.
say.
How did
Yeah.
that happen?
Well, he had been involved with the company early on,
Hmm.
and he kind of bounced back and forth, and he became part of the under a fellow by the name of the spot here. I can't think of his name.
Oh, that's all right.
Nonetheless, the guy who was in charge of picking the music,
Hmm.
and he worked in that department and eventually became an executive of that department.
Hmm. Do you know who?
of, of
Oh, do you know who
go ahead.
arranged? Do you know who did the arrangements on those Victor recordings? Was it all one person? Because they all sound quite similar on most records.
Probably, yeah. I think probably most there were probably standard arrangements made. And of course they had to be arranged for recording.
Yeah.
So certain instruments couldn't be used and whatever. Um, I can't answer that. I don't know.
Hmm.
But I would imagine that the conductor, the head of the orchestra for Victor, probably had a team, and they could probably whip out a quick arrangement like in lickety split and just
Hmm.
get rid of all the instruments they can't record with, and then make their recordings, which was quite a detailed adventure as well, making those records.
Yeah.
Because you're familiar with Berliner records.
Yep.
I don't know. Do you have any Berliner yet?
No. No.
Not yet. Okay, you will. Don't worry, you will. But the Berliner records were called acid etched, and they were recorded on a disc that was made of sort of like a pewter of sorts. That's not the exact type of metal it was, but like that, with a fatty substance on top. Zinc. It was a zinc disc. I'm sorry, zinc with a fatty disc on a bunch of fatty wax on top. You'd
Yeah.
record it, cut into the wax, and then you'd immerse it in acid. And the acid would eat into the zinc. And that's how you'd get your grooves
Hmm.
onto the record. And so you could play that master and know if it was good or bad right away.
Hmm.
Once you do wax recording, you can't do that anymore.
Hmm.
And it led to a lot more problems because they would make the recording and they had to wait until they went to the process of 3 days of finally printing one out to see if it was good.
Yeah. So that must have been. Oh, it was a very detailed process at the
Oh,
not just with the pro- not just with the production of the discs, but also the recording, you know.
the recording was such a difficult thing because you had certain factors you had to look out for. First off was blasting. And so it was a careful dance that had to be done in front of that recording horn to keep people close enough, but not too close, and far enough, but not too far from the recording horn. And it would depend on the weather. The weather would change everything. The humidity would change everything. The barometric pressure would change everything. And so if you made a great recording the day before, and Edison did this once, the recording was fantastic. So he had all the chairs nailed in place. So everybody would sit in exactly the same spot. They did it the next day. It was dreadful. The
Oh,
weather changed.
yep.
So I mean, it was really difficult because when you made a record, let's just say you're going to make a record for Victor, you would come in and then you would do several rehearsals. Then you would do the first test, which they would play back to see if it's balanced. If not, then you move people around, got bigger chairs, put people up higher, put the singer in a different position, then do another test. Then you'd play it back and they'd move people around again until they got it right. This is exhausting.
Yep.
You think about it. And then finally you would take like 3 takes. So by the end of the day, I mean, they had been singing or playing all day. And it was backbreaking in many respects to make a record in those days.
Yeah. Um,
We don't
yeah, it's a forgotten art of how they did it,
Yeah.
really. It's
Yes, it is.
very
And
detailed, you know. I didn't know
it's
about all
detailed,
this.
but also the thing is you have to understand that the horn reacts differently, once again, depending on the weather, but also to every instrument.
Yep.
And so the way a band is usually set up is not the way they're going to record. They have to totally reverse everything and bring softer instruments up front, the louder ones in the back. And if you're doing a solo, you'd kind of walk up to the horn, start playing, and then walk back. That kind of stuff. And try to be quiet without kicking a music stand or something.
Yeah, well, that would ruin the whole take,
Yes.
Yeah.
Nellie Melba's famous for that.
Mm-hmm.
She was making a record. She said it was a great record. She said, then I kicked a chair and I let out with a big, loud, audible damn. That was the end of that record.
Yeah, I heard Caruso also had a bad take once where there was a music stand that got kicked over. Do you know anything about that take? Well, there was some kind of
probably a lot of them, I would imagine, but
yeah,
it
but there
wasn't.
was
It
one
wasn't
that was
released.
released.
It was released.
I believe so. Yes, I don't know the name of it. I'd have to get back to you on it, but
At the end of the record, probably there's a crash.
oh, I'm not sure, but they must have left it in. They didn't retake it.
Sometimes you would get noises like this bang or woof sound. Sometimes that was blowing the air off the wax to get rid of the buildup. And sometimes it would shake the needle a little bit. You get a little noise.
Yeah. So, when stuff like that happens, was it expensive to do a new take with new discs and everything?
Sure.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing is with musicians, they work on musician time. And if they go above it, they go into overtime. And so they would be upset about that because it would cost Victor more to make the record.
Yeah. I'm going to change the subject a little bit, but I'm going to so in 1999 you started the Thomas Edison Historic Recording Project and you interviewed a lot of notable people for that. One of them was President Gerald Ford. How did that happen,
Well, I wrote him.
And he responded?
Well, the world is a little different now. I mean, it's, with the internet, everything has changed. But in the 1990s, the internet was not a thing yet. I mean, it existed, but it was kind of looked at like a toy. And so I started this project in probably about June of 1999. And the whole idea was to capture the voices of influential individuals who have made history.
Yeah.
And record them and preserve them on wax. And then 100 years later, you could listen to them and stuff like that. And so I had the machine, I got the horn, and once again, a lot of people weren't doing this at the time. This was kind of novel. I mean, I see a lot of people doing it now, these 25 years later. But this was the first time that people were really traveling around and making recordings since the days when they were traveling around and making recordings, and I just followed the ideas of Edison. Edison wanted to record the voices of great men and women. And so I did my best to try to get it to work. And there's a little secret to it, little psychology. These people are famous and they're constantly have a microphone pushed in their face to talk. Well, I did it differently. I brought a horn. It was so different, and they had never done it before. They were having fun. And so many times everybody would say, this is fun. and they forgot who they were.
Yeah.
And they would act totally different. President Ford started telling me about his father's paint store. And he just talked about as a kid sitting down, they had an old phonograph, a wind-up phonograph. And
Yeah.
And he said he used to sit down and listen to it as a boy. It was so much fun. And he would just go into and he really got all excited about it because it was something that had it never really kind of experienced. And I brought a recording of President Theodore Roosevelt. And I decided to do something that no one had ever done before. I had the 26th president talk to the 38th president
Hmm.
through the phonograph, which I thought was kind of cool.
Hmm. And had he ever heard Roosevelt's voice before?
No, he hadn't, and
Ah,
he sat there and said, um, "It's a good speech, but a very strange voice."
yeah, I've heard it. It's
Yeah,
not the voice you'd expect from Teddy, you know?
no, you kind
Very
of
high.
expect to hear, like, hey, and
Yeah.
it's very much the issues for which we stand. It's this little tiny, like Tweety Bird kind of
Yeah.
voice. Okay,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
that's and it was a big shock for me when I first heard that. I was like going, who the hell is this? And in those days, most people, didn't really care about how you talked or whatever.
Yeah.
Today, everything's about image.
Hmm.
But, you got to remember people like Lincoln, whose voice was supposedly a bit higher than Roosevelt's and squeaked, and he had a very strong accent. So, that kind of thing. If
Hmm.
talking like that would be kind of shocking today.
Yeah.
But he was like a backwoodsman,
Hmm.
and but it was really fascinating to watch Ford react to Roosevelt,
Hmm. Yeah.
which
And
that situation had never occurred. So I just thought it was fun to have one president talk to another
yeah,
100 years later.
it's interesting. This was just 25 around 25 years ago that you did this, and I guess it would have been hard to find a recording of Teddy Roosevelt's voice unless you knew what you were doing. Now it's just a quick
Well,
search on YouTube.
I- well, now yeah, everything's there. But I would buy the records. I go to phonograph shows, which were
Hmm.
in existence. Starting in the 70s, they started, and I purchased all the Roosevelt cylinders,
Hmm.
and just one I kept to use for the recording project, which I would always have Theodore Roosevelt come, and he did speeches all over the place. It was fascinating. I brought him to see Bob Dole, and Teddy Roosevelt talked, and we ran into the governor of Texas on the way, and she said, "What do you have here?" And I said, "Oh, we have a phonograph and Theodore Roosevelt." And she said, "You have to play this." So we played it in the lobby of this huge Washington, D.C. political office.
Hmm.
And before long, there were hundreds of people in the lobby all listening to Theodore Roosevelt. And they were and at the end, they all just cheered, applauded, and
Hmm.
it was surreal.
Yeah. And
But it was fascinating because you take that and you create an ambassador. Theodore Roosevelt was my ambassador,
yeah, I see.
and it was
So
kind of fun.
it's interesting, all these politicians, they must have been, they'd never, and all those hundreds of people that were there you were talking about, never heard his voice, but he's known as one of the most famous presidents of all time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, uh, he actually only made records in 1912
yeah.
after he was president. When he ran again, he decided to run again a third time, which didn't work. But those are the recordings that he made when he was a little older. And he didn't live that long. He only lived to be 60. And people suggested, wasn't it the recording mechanism that made him sound like that? I said, no. Let's listen to William Howard Taft.
He sounded normal.
Sounded very, very different. He kind of sounded like Eisenhower to a degree, William Howard Taft.
I was surprised.
And
I thought his voice would be like a really deep kind of
it was,
voice,
it
but
was yeah, well,
it was,
compared to Theodore Roosevelt, everybody's voice was deep, you
Yeah.
know.
So
But oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I don't know. You go ahead.
No,
So
you had some.
so Taft, did you end up showing the voice of Taft to any of the people on your trips?
No, I
No.
did not. I kept it to Roosevelt, um, because first off, it was on cylinder. It was on blue amber. Also, it was unbreakable,
Mm.
and everything by Taft is breakable.
Mm.
And so I didn't want to take any chances. I also sent Theodore Roosevelt into space.
Did you?
Yes, I was invited to send something up on the space shuttle. And I wanted to send a pencil, Thomas Edison's pencil. I said, that's a good, that's just going up to the most recent organized research laboratory, which is in space. I said, they're using pencils. So I gave the pencil to NASA, and everything was well and good. And then I got a phone call from NASA, and they said, we do not send organic materials into space. I said, that means you're not taking the pencil. They said, correct. We need something else. So I tried to think of something, and I said, who was the first president to fly? Theodore Roosevelt. So I sent a cylinder to NASA, and it went up in the space shuttle.
Yep.
Teddy Roosevelt flew around the Earth for a while.
Did you get it back?
Yeah, got it back.
Yep.
The commander of the space shuttle came back to see me, and we had a big event. And it was really kind of funny. It was Commander Polanski.
Hmm.
And we had a big ceremony, and he handed me the cylinder and said this had traveled 8 million miles or something like that. And then he looked at me, and he winked. And he said, I took the pencil too. The Russians use pencils in their space things. And we have to have the pens, the gravity or whatever. Just use a pencil. It's easier.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was kind of a fun thing with the recording project to do that. And we recorded, of course, Polanski speaking about space and the space shuttle.
Mm.
And there's so many other people. I mean, we recorded, newscasters and, Buzz Aldrin from the first mission to the moon.
Tell me about
I
that.
mean, that's pretty incredible if you think about it. He was the first man who walked on the moon to make a cylinder.
Mm.
And so far as I know, the only one.
Yep.
Nobody else has made cylinder records. And he was pretty fascinating. I heard him talking about, like, his father had been involved in aviation and was in early on in the beginnings of aviation. And Buzz Aldrin was born in 1930, and he's still with us as I speak. And I contacted him and his office and explained the situation, and they agreed. And it was going to be done at the Liberty Science Center in Jersey City, New Jersey.
Mm.
And went there. I listened to him talk. He talked about so much stuff with space. And then he made 2 cylinders, reading from his book, which was called The Return, which was about a basketball player with the initials MJ who goes to the moon. But it's not Michael Jordan.
Is it just fictional?
Yes.
Yeah.
I figured, I don't care if you order from a menu, it's still Buzz Aldrin.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just to capture. Yeah. I mean, I thought that was an amazing coup to capture the voice of, someone so special in the history of technology, if you think about it.
He's been on the moon. I mean, that's
Yeah. I mean, that's
incredible in itself.
pretty damn incredible. Yeah.
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 When you were
And he,
sitting next to him, did you just when you were sitting there, did you just look at him and think, this guy's been on the moon? Isn't that incredible?
that was going through my head at the time.
Yeah.
He was also not too easy to work with. He was a little prickly. Uh, but but I was thinking about that all the time. And there was a New York Times photographer next to us, and also AP, Associated Press cameraman next to us. And we're trying to do this. And he was busy reading from his book, so the book's in front of his face. And so all the pictures has him just basically looking at a book, and me trying to get out of his way because he can't see what he's doing when he's talking into the thing. But it was interesting. We did it.
Yeah. I'll have
We
to.
did it as well as he took off from the moon, because he mentioned something to me. It's kind of fascinating. He said he dressed Neil Armstrong, because that's the way they worked it out, because it was so tight in that lunar lander. And he said after Neil left, he said, then I dressed. And he said, when I turned, I heard a snap. Not what you want to hear. And he looked around, and the switch that hit the burner to take off got broken off.
Oh,
But fortunately, Aldrin was a genius in these fields, and he figured how to jury rig it using a felt pen, which incidentally he always carries with him wherever he goes, because that saved their lives.
yes. Well, they would have been. Would they have
Yeah.
been able to land, or would they just be stuck?
No, they were on the moon already when that happened.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have been able to leave.
Oh, that's not what you want to.
And there would be no way to rescue them.
No. Yeah.
And it's interesting, President Nixon made 2 recordings right when they landed on the moon, in case it didn't work and they died on the moon. He had a speech for that already recorded.
But
It was interesting.
they lived.
Yeah, they made it. Everything was fine.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. That was 1969, 55 years ago this July.
That's crazy to think 69 was 55 years ago. It's incredible, really. It seems like
It's even more incredible to me, I'll tell you. Don't know how this time went by so fast.
Yeah. Yeah,
and as you get older, you need seatbelts. I mean, because everything, you say, I'm going to work on this today, and next thing you look, it's 3:30 in the afternoon. What the heck happened? Time goes so much faster when you get older. When you're younger, you can't wait for things, and it takes forever.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you go into high dramatic or whatever, and off you go.
I'll have to switch over into another meeting because we're just about to run out of our time, but then we'll do the next part on the new meeting.
Okay.
Just talking to Jack Stanley. This is part 2. Now, when you were younger and you were first collecting these old records, going back to that subject, did you have a favorite singer or band from that time?
Actually, it's kind of interesting, because one of the first singers I discovered was Henry Burr. I didn't realize how many records he made. and so I had a couple of Henry Burr records, and I went to an old piano shop one day, and I heard a player piano playing, and I said, I have a recording of Henry Burr singing that. And there was this loud voice in the back saying, Henry Burr! And out came this old gentleman who worked in the place. And before long, I had a pile of Henry Burr records like this. And I was very happy. I was like 16 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And so I really had my Henry Burr kick, and now I've kind of had enough of Henry Burr. I love Billy Murray. I love Irving Kaufman.
Yep.
I actually got to sing with one of the Victor recording artists.
Oh,
Um, his name was Joe Smith, and there was a group called the Avon Comedy Four,
oh yes.
and he was the baritone of the Avon Comedy Four, and also he was in the comedy team called Smith and Dale. Dr. Cronkite, I've got a headache and it hurts when I do this. Well, don't do this. That was the old
Yeah.
routine. And if you've ever seen Neil Simon's Sunshine Boys, it's based on Smith and Dale.
Okay.
So I used to go to the Englewood Actors Home in Englewood, New Jersey, and I would visit all these old vaudevillians, and Joe Smith was there.
Hmm.
And he would get a couple of people together, and we'd sing some barbershop harmony all together. So I got to finally sing with a Victor artist, which was kind of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when did he pass away?
1981.
Oh, so he lived a long time.
Yeah.
They're
He
only
was 97. Yeah,
Oh,
97 when he died.
wow. So he had
But
a long life.
and I asked him questions about Billy Murray, and he said, "Oh, I knew Billy Murray." I'd ask him all these various people, and he knew them all, and
Mm.
he used to have lunch with them, and
Yeah.
he had so many fascinating things to say. And he had a Victrola in his room, and he would play old Victor records that he made and did with other people.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. And did you meet anyone else who was kind of involved in any early recordings?
I'm sure I did. Off the top of my head, Joe Smith was the most prominent.
Yeah. Just
Um, I talked to a number of people, but they made records later, like in the 30s and
mm,
but none of the really pioneer people.
yeah.
Because Joe Smith was born in what 1884,
Oh,
so
yeah. It's pretty
so
old.
he's of that same age as Henry Burr and
Mm,
a little bit younger than Billy Murray.
yeah. And
I'm sure I did. I am positive I did. In
yeah.
fact, I'm almost yes, I am. I know I did because I went to the Edison site and saw some of the old performers, but I can't tell you their names off the top of my head.
So there was the big ones, you had Billy Murray, Henry Burr. One of my favorites, I think he's probably the best, if not the best, World War One singer. Was I'm sure you know him, Arthur Fields.
Who?
Arthur Fields.
Oh, Arthur Fields. Arthur Fields.
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes,
Oh yeah, he did lots of stuff. He had a great delivery. He had his own record label for a while.
yes, I heard about that. Yeah. And
And
did you know is there anything about him that that's quite uncommon or a lot of people wouldn't know?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, he died in a nursing home
Yeah.
in a fire.
Yes, that's right. In
And
Tampa,
I
Florida.
learned this from a fellow by the name of Joe Franklin, who used to do a radio show. And, he knew all the old acoustic recording artists, but he said they identified him by his dentures. That's how they. But
Oh,
he was lost in a fire.
yeah.
But he made so many records
Mm.
for everybody.
Yep.
Another one was Irving Kaufman.
Yes, he was a wonderful singer. Although I think
And I
he
used to
got better
listen
with
to
age.
him on the radio. Huh?
I think Irving Kaufman got better with age because towards especially with the invention of the microphone and electric recording, I think
Sure.
in my opinion, I think at the start he sounded quite a bit like Billy Murray, but when he was doing some of his later music in the 1920s and he even did some recordings in the 1940s, he really sounded
Oh,
like he
yeah.
was top. Yeah.
He put out an album in the 1970s.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
used to listen to him on the radio, and he would be talking about his career and stuff like that with Joe Franklin, who I later met. And and he would sing on the radio. But his career went back to like 1914, somewhere right around there,
Yep.
1912, 1914.
Mm.
He was a wonderful performer. Also had to learn, and this is what was difficult for Billy Murray. Billy Murray had a very unique style of singing, as you can well attest. It was almost shooting at the recording horn. He would just send this powerful burst of like pop, pop, pop at the recording horn. Once the microphone came out, that didn't work anymore. And so he had a really rough time. In fact, his manufacturer of records or making records just fell off the cliff after the microphone came out. If you think about it, he's there every now and then, but his massive amount of records was no longer, his style was old fashioned. His style was looked upon as like passé.
I've heard those later Billy Murray recordings. He didn't sound the same. He had to soften his tone.
Correct. Yeah. He had to totally change the way he sang, and then he just kind of sounded like everybody else.
Yep. Yeah, it was a real shame. He continued with Edison, correct? Where they were still making acoustic recordings.
Edison kept him on until 1929.
Yeah.
And then he got some wonderful work. There was a lot of stuff in movie theaters where the audience would sing along, follow the bouncing ball.
Yep.
He would make those recordings for the motion picture theaters.
Yeah, and he did Popeye as well and Betty Boop.
Yeah.
So he kind of went into the cartoon world later on. And then
sorry, go ahead.
In the 1940s, he kind of made a little bit of a comeback with his Bluebird records.
His Bluebirds, yes.
Yeah. Did they sell well?
I would imagine not like his hits of the teens.
Yeah.
But I'm sure they sold well enough. I talked to a fellow that was on one of those records. His name was Jim Walsh. And Jim Walsh wrote an article once a month in Hobbies magazine about pioneer recording artists. And he was from, I forget, North Carolina or West Virginia, something like that. And he kind of talked like, he had one of those accents. And he was big into animals. And so he'd be talking about Billy Murray. The next sentence was about a possum he had. And then he'd get back to Billy Murray and stuff like that. But he was in that recording session when they, hip hooray, hit da da, and he sang in the chorus. He was very, very proud of himself for that.
Yeah.
Kind of cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, all of these old recordings there, I find them really quite wonderful. But I wonder in concerts and vaudeville houses and halls and theaters, did the music and instrumentation, did it sound the same as it did on the records? Because if you watch a movie from the 40s, it kind of sounds very different to and they're talking about, like, if it's a movie about vaudeville that came out in the 40s or 50s, the music sounds very different to what it does on the recordings.
Well, it's got a touch of modernized. If case in point, in the movie Titanic, from 1997, I think. The fellow who's the star, Jack, sings "Come Josephine in My Flying Machine." But he sings it in a modern style. He doesn't sing it like you would in 1912. It's kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah.
And I understand that because they had to sell the movie and they didn't want to make it sound like an old-fashioned thing like that.
Yeah. Is there anyone who's kind of done it authentically?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think you're seeing a lot of it now. I'm watching a lot of young people, a lot of young singers, a lot of instrumentalists.
Hmm.
A fella I do some podcasts with, Gavin Rice, um, is doing a lot of that kind of stuff right now.
Is he a singer?
Yeah, he's an instrumentalist. He plays everything.
Oh, I see. And he records, does he?
Yes, he records. There's another fella I know who's doing Rudy Valley stuff. Of
Oh,
course, that's with microphones, of course.
yeah.
Um, and I think there's a lot of people that are doing the vaudeville style of music, for novelty shows and stuff like that. It isn't something for the general public because the general public's not going to be very interested.
Hmm. Yeah, unfortunately not. But
I mean, we'll get a kick out of it. We'll say this is great,
yeah,
and all 17 people next to us will say the same thing.
yeah.
But you're
But
not going to get the massive audience,
if I try and play that music to my father, for example, he won't really show much of an interest because
No, it's
it's not for
understandable.
everyone.
No,
Yeah.
it is not. It's an acquired taste.
Yeah. At first I couldn't understand a word they were saying in those old
Mhm.
records. They just sounded I could just hear the crackle. Maybe I was listening to a bad record, but I couldn't understand a word of it. Um, I keep listening to these old records more and more just because a lot of the songs that I had listened to, because I was always a big fan of the crooners like Dean Martin and people like that, Al Martino and Jim Reeves, even Andy Williams. Um,
Frank Sinatra.
yeah, Frank Sinatra. Um, Lots of people they sing songs of the 19 tens and 20s and sometimes even
Sure.
1900s. And you go back and
In their
listen.
style. In
Yes, in
their
their
style.
style. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And I don't remember what song it was. I think it might have been oh, I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles, perhaps.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because Dean did that on this kind of he did an album of these old songs, kind of in his style, but also kind of in an old fashion kind of style, but modernized.
Hmm.
This was the 1970s. I go back and I listen to the first version of I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles, um, 1919, Henry Burr and Albert Campbell. When I first
Right.
heard that record, I didn't really know what they were saying. It just sounded pretty crackly to me.
Yeah.
Now that I've grown an ear for it, I can understand every word. And
That is an interesting thing. It's a gradual thing that people who collect early recordings develop, and that is a filter in your ear.
yep,
Because when you play these old records for people, they're like, "Oh my God," you know,
yeah,
all this hiss, all this, and they're like, "How can you even listen to this?" And I don't hardly even notice the hiss.
me neither.
It's something that we have filtered out, but we often forget that other people don't, and what
Yep,
they basically hear is just the noise rather than the music a lot of times.
yep. I remember like playing Al Jolson, You Made Me Love You, 1913. Oh,
Oh yeah.
I played it for played it at school once, and everyone's like, "Oh, what's this? What's this?" It sounds like something that would be in a horror film, or sounds haunted.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I guess in a way it makes sense, because we, well, people often associate that with kind of the unknown in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. In a sense, it's like going to school and bringing a typewriter with you.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, it's like,
Just
what the hell is that?
yeah, exactly. Mm,
It's something so foreign today. People don't
yeah.
know exactly what a typewriter is.
Oh well, they
And
know what it is, but they don't use them.
and when I was your age, I was bringing old phonographs to school, and they thought I was, short a couple of chromosomes. Uh, you know, what is this? This is, crazy stuff. people like what they like,
Yeah.
and a lot of times they don't have a tolerance for what they don't.
Mm.
And so early recordings represent much of what people
Mm.
didn't care too much for. Or
Yeah.
they'll listen to it once and say, "That's cute.
Mm.
I don't want to ever hear it again,"
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yes, I know what you mean. Like,
Yeah,
oh,
it's just the progression. So what
yeah.
are other questions that you wanted to ask while we're thinking about this and
Yeah.
talking about all this stuff?
We talked a
Because
lot
this is
about
kind of fun. We're talking about a little bit of everything here.
yeah, we talked a lot about Victor. I don't think we've mentioned Columbia yet. And
No?
that's a whole nother thing. I mean, Nora
That's
Bayes,
another ball of
Al
wax.
Jolson.
Columbia is a very strange company because it was founded, its roots come from the Edison Company. It's interesting because in the earliest days of the Edison Company, he formed various districts for recording. And each one was like the New York district, the District of Columbia district, the Pennsylvania district, etc. And the District of Columbia district
Mm.
broke away and formed their own company.
Okay.
And then they merged with the Bell Tainter group, which created the graphophone. And so they became the Columbia Graphophone Company.
Mm.
And they had no patents whatsoever on disc records. And so they just did everything. They broke every law, just did it,
They were
and claim up the Climax record, if you're familiar with that.
um I've heard of it. I'm not awfully familiar.
It was totally illegal.
What was it?
It was disc records. It was I think I have one here. I'll show you.
Oh, okay.
Hold on. Pardon the. Is it in here? Oh, not there.
You got a lot of records there.
Oh, these are early 7-inch. Here, this is a Climax record.
Oh, okay. And this was illegal, was it?
Yeah,
How so? They didn't have any patents.
there's no patents.
Yeah.
And the individual who had the patent for the disc record was Berliner.
Yep.
And so um, Victor and Columbia had a lot of squabbles because since Columbia, and it's a long story and I don't want to go into because it'll take 4 meetings to explain it all. But the Columbia Company had a lawyer his name was Philip Morrow, and he was the individual that brought down the Berliner gramophone.
Mm.
With using a Bell Tainter patent that was totally misused. It was called a needle moved by a groove, which was for the cylinder machine. There's a gear in the back with a needle that rides a screw to move the floating head. And so he put a gramophone reproducer on a record, and the groove moved the needle.
Mm.
That's how they put Berliner out of business.
Mm.
It's really a perversion of a patent.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then that brought Victor, since I've got these right here, I'll pull this out for you. The first record that ever has a label is this.
The Butterfly Dance, Salsa's band.
Yeah, this is Sousa, and
Is this
this
single
was
sided?
this is a improved gramophone record.
Huh. I have not seen one of those before.
Yeah, they're quite rare, and they only made them for like a month and a half by Eldridge Johnson.
Yeah.
And of course, he used the word gramophone,
Well, that's interesting.
and it was the consolidated. Here's a little tag in the back. It's a consolidated gramophone.
Oh, so it's single sided.
Yes, everything was single-sided early on. And he went into business, and he was sued by Columbia and Zonophone, which was Siemens, who was doing lots of hijinks, and he was doing everything illegally as well. And Johnson was not put out of business, but lost the right to use the word gramophone. And so it became the Victor Talking Machine Company.
I see. That's where that...
After a lot of other work, on October 3rd, 1901, it was founded. Berliner and Johnson merged and created the Victor Talking Machine Company. There's 95% of the history in between there I didn't talk about, but there's an awful lot took place.
Yeah.
It would make a great miniseries, I'll tell you.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
So much backstabbing, so much, hijinks going on, people secretly working in everybody else's factory and stuff like that.
And so I mean, Victor kind of exists today in a small form or another, but Columbia's the only major label that exists today that is still major that existed back then. They've kind of lasted 120 years.
It's not the same company.
Oh.
It's not the same company. The Columbia Graphophone Company went bankrupt in 1922 or so, and they were bought out by a banking house who ran it for a while. And then it was bought by the Columbia Broadcasting System. That's how the name stayed the same.
Okay. Yeah.
CBS.
CBS, yeah. In Australia, we didn't have Columbia Records for quite a while. It was all under CBS Records. With our LPs and 45s and everything.
And I think Sony now kind of owns the rights to the Columbia disc. It's kind of hard to tell who's in charge of what anymore, because these companies have been bought and sold, and I think in Japan the Victor division still exists.
Yep. Well, and then in the US, Victor was sold to RCA, the Radio.
Yes. Radio Corporation of America.
Yeah.
And Eldridge Johnson, years later, said, "I always regretted selling Victor." He felt it was a big mistake because he saw RCA was very focused on radio, which is correct. Radio was the thing.
Yeah.
But Johnson, who had an ally named Thomas Edison, who also hated radio, both went to their doom shaking their fist at the new technology.
Yeah.
I got to talk to Thomas Edison's youngest son, Theodore.
Okay.
And he gave me lots of stories about his father. Early recording. There's so much stuff to tell you.
I've seen quite a bit of it on your YouTube channel. It's very fascinating.
Oh yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Theodore was fascinating. He would sit there and he would just, and he'd said his father would be, since his father had mastoid trouble with his ears, he couldn't hear very well. He would wear these headsets, and he wanted to try to listen to the radio. And so there was an operator there, and he was looking at the operator and yelling, "Louder, louder." And the operator came to Theodore and said, "Mr. Edison, I can't make it any louder for your father. The post and the magnet are banging together, and there's sparks shooting out of the top of the headset. If I make it any louder, I'm going to electrocute your father." So that was the problem, since he couldn't hear that well, especially in his later years.
Yeah.
He came to the understanding that electricity was not very good in the sense of using electrical recording, microphones, which the fascinating thing is that Edison had a hand in developing the microphone. He had a hand in developing the Edison effect bulb is the predecessor to the vacuum tube.
Mm.
All those things that he had been involved in, he
He kind
eventually
of
came to dislike.
he did well. He built the modern world, or was very significant in building.
Yes, that's true. I
He
mean,
came to dislike what he had helped build.
yeah, I think in some respects, if you think about it, a lot of times find any bunch of old people and they'll be sitting there, they're shaking their fist at, you
Yes.
know, I can't stand this nonsense. Turn this off. He became basically a cranky old man. you know,
Yeah.
he had been the person that totally changed the world. If you think about it,
Yeah.
and he had influence on like three generations.
Mm.
Grandparents, grandchildren, all knew Edison from the time they were pretty much young,
Mm.
since he started in his 20s when he was successful,
Yeah.
you know. And he uh, he lived long enough to become somewhat of a caricature of himself.
Mm. Yeah. That's quite interesting. A lot of people, like I never knew all this about him, his involvement in radio and his his dislike
Well,
towards radio and
he absolutely despised radio. In fact, he sent a note to his son saying, as soon as this radio craze is over, people will come back to the acoustic phonograph. He couldn't have been more wrong.
hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, you're trying, so you
Yeah,
might
I'm
prove him
trying.
right.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll have to wait another 100 years and see what's happened.
This is true.
Yeah. And you were talking, I'll go back to something you mentioned a bit earlier in the first half.
Sure.
You sang with Joe Smith from the Avon Comedy Four, and so you're a singer, correct?
Yeah, I worked as a singer for a number of years. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
I sang for the New Jersey Racing Authority, did all the racetracks,
Mm.
and then I worked at Disney and sang there and stuff like that for a while.
Yeah. What kind of songs did you sing?
Zippity doo dah. The
Yeah.
stuff that everybody at Disney hates.
Disney songs.
Yeah, because you hear them all the time. It's like
Mm.
it's funny. A funny little aside, real quick, and I don't want to take too much
Oh
time
no,
with
no,
this,
no, that's fine.
but when I did work for Disney, it's a little fun thing. When you were not liked or they wanted to fire you and get rid of you, they would put you into It's a Small World. And after an entire day of hearing "It's a small world," you come walking out of there and you're like,
Mm.
your brain is turned to soup. I mean, it's pretty rough being in there, and that's how they would get rid of some of the folks years ago.
Mm. Would you have any advice for a young singer who
Are
want?
you are you a singer?
Yes, I'm a singer.
Okay. Um, Advice. It's a different market now. The world has changed once again. I think that you have the opportunity to do much more than like someone like me could have because you have the internet.
Mm.
You have YouTube. You could start doing singing and do a show, do it every day, just do a new song
Yeah.
and get people to follow you and people to talk about you and do something different. See, that's the secret. That's what I did. This Edison recording project, no one ever did anything like that.
Mm.
And it now I watch and I see on YouTube people are doing it all over the place now.
Mm.
And I'm very happy to see that. I wasn't the one that caused it to happen. There were people before me that did it, but it was a very small fraction of people doing it because, um, once again, the recording project is now being run by Wyatt Marcus. You might be familiar with him. I don't know.
No.
He does all kinds of phonograph repairs and whatever. And I gave him copies I had of all of the wax recording. And he has a site dedicated to that. And he's starting to make recordings. And I want to talk to him about having like a celebration for the 25th anniversary. Be kind of fun.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Maybe I'd like to get my original team together that I had at the time, because we traveled all over the place to do this. You know, you think about getting onto a plane and trying to get through security, you know, with a recording horn, you know, and all these blanks and whatever. And, you know, people would be like, you know, what the heck is this?
I can imagine getting through airport security with all this.
Oh, you'd be amazed the amount of times I was stopped. And then once they figured out what it was, they said, does it work? And then you have to sit there and show them how it works.
Oh, yeah.
But one of these days, I'm going to write down and do a history of that whole recording project, because there's so many people and so many stories, you know. I got to meet some incredible people that I never would believe I could have met. And if it wasn't for that project, I never would have.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was a wonderful entree into reaching out and talking to people about what interested them and what their advice is to people. A lot of times I just say, would you like to say something to encourage people in the future? That's what Gerald Ford did. You know, he talked about what his generation had done. He said, now it's your turn.
Yeah. You know, one thing I would love to see as a singer would just be, I don't know, I'd love to one day be able to sing onto a cylinder or an acoustic disc and like do some recordings there. That would be really up my alley. I don't know of it.
You are what, 16 years old now?
16. Yeah.
16. Okay.
Yeah.
You have the world is your oyster.
Yep.
You know, you can do so much. I really think that you should try to do something. If you're familiar, just a little bit of advice here. Boris Karloff, who played Frankenstein, he went and got a ride home one day from Lon Chaney, who did Phantom of the Opera, very famous silent picture star.
Yeah.
And he asked Lon Chaney for advice. And Lon Chaney's advice was, do something that no one's ever done before, and do it better than anyone else can. That's good advice.
Yeah. And
you should do something different. I don't know, maybe do Billy Murray songs in your own style.
You'd have to be careful with some of Billy's songs these days, but
everyone's going to get offended about something. I mean,
most of them are still all right.
Yeah, you can change a word here and there.
Yeah.
There's certain words we don't want to use anymore. But if you look at Billy Murray's songs, they're just fun songs.
Yeah.
You know. Everything from It's Not Your Nationality, It's Simply You, to songs like Some Little Bug Is Gonna Find You Someday.
Yeah. Oh, there's also he did so many great songs, and
he did.
Henry Burr did a lot of amazing songs.
Sure. And those vaudeville quartets.
Yep. Peerless.
You know, the Peerless, the American, the
Hayden,
the Avon Comedy 4.
Oh, yep. Who else was there? There was lots.
Oh, there's a whole mess of them.
Yeah.
And they're always changing people. You know, Albert Campbell, as you mentioned before, his career went all the way back to Berliner. And in 1925, Henry Burr was the business manager. He he had his fingers in the business, and he got rid of Albert Campbell and got a younger singer to sing with him.
Yeah. That's
And then Albert Campbell went and recorded for Edison, like everybody else did. The kind of like the rejected groups. Billy Murray wasn't that popular anymore. And
yep.
Henry Burr, interestingly enough, went to radio
Mm.
and performed in radio until 1941 when he died.
Mm-hmm.
He was here in Chicago, as a matter of fact. Louis James, who's a big singer, he got into radio in Chicago as well. Most of these people became sometimes actors or voice actors on radio. And a lot of them just quit and went back to other professions.
But, I guess it wasn't an easy job to be a full-time recording artist at all.
It was a magnificent period of time. If we take the period, like let's say 1900 to about 1923, the golden age. People were, they couldn't make enough records. If you'd look at those Victor supplements, you see every month all of these records being made. And in the case of like opera, they were just constantly making recordings of all different opera singers singing the same arias. You could get the same aria sung by 25 different people. And that was a proven thing. And then it just kind of died. And it was never the same again.
Yep.
The old
electrical.
The old saying is, they say heroes know when to die. So Caruso, when he died, was right at that point, just before everything stopped being that popular.
Yeah. That's quite. That's really interesting. I didn't. I don't know. I didn't know that. I knew Caruso had died in 1921, but I didn't know that after that the whole popularity of records kind of went down 1923.
Well, here's the thing that happens, like in 23, 24.
I just got to tell you, I got less than a minute left on this.
Okay. Real quick.
Yep.
1923, 1924, radio is really starting. And no matter how crappy that radio was, it sounded better than an acoustic record.
Yep.
And that was the beginning of the whole fracture of the industry. And then, of course, Victor and Columbia were dragged screaming and kicking into the electrical recording industry. They didn't want it. They wanted to stay with acoustic.
Yeah.
But what was happening is that the Victor company, you had to remember that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That was kind of like the attitude. And Eldridge Johnson hated radio.
Mm-hmm.
And he had it, as I mentioned before. Thomas Edison felt the same way. So they were kind of kindred spirits in that regard. And they were forced, basically, because sales dropped drastically, starting in like in the 20s, 1923. 24, the Christmas season was a disaster for Victor, which was never that way. They always sold, countless stuff. And, excuse me. And, what was it? The Bell Labs. Bell Labs was developing that whole system, the electric system, from Western Electric system. And, that was eventually the recording system, became the orthophonic. But Columbia, while Victor was diddling and deciding whether they were going to do it or not, Columbia bought rights to it. So they were able to put out electric records as well. Victor held back on the technology because they felt threatened by it because it was something new, and you had a lot of issues going on. You had Eldridge Johnson had a nervous breakdown. He was not in great shape, and the whole industry was changing, and he wanted to get out, and he did. He sold the company, I think in 1926, to a banking house that eventually sold it to RCA.
Hmm. Yeah, well, the RCA Victor, in a way it was a success selling it to RC. Well, it was a success selling it to. It was a good thing that it got sold to RCA eventually, whether Eldridge Johnson was happy with the change or not. I mean that label. The Victor part of the label was still selling well. RCA
Sure,
Victor
sure,
selling well into the 1970s, I
sure.
believe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the 70s, 80s
yeah.
even. I was at the 100th anniversary of the Victor Company. I was one of the people involved in that celebration, and it's interesting who runs everything now. I mean, nobody really kind of knows anymore. Like everything's torn apart. Nothing quite exists as it once was. The Victor Company was the preeminent company.
Yeah.
Edison always remained somewhat of a distant third
Yeah.
compared to Columbia. Columbia was more successful than Edison at certain points.
Hmm.
Um, I just put an article that just went into the Antique Phonograph Monthly. I don't know if you get that or not, the journal.
I'll sign up for it.
I have a 3-part series I just put in. Um, I was pushed and prodded, thankfully, by Michael Sherman, who did the Victor books and stuff like that. And he said, "You should do this, blah, blah, blah." And he kept after me, and I did it. And it's a 3-part series on Edison and his responses to music, his critiques of recordings. It's fascinating. It's a window into Edison that most people have never seen.
Hmm.
And the unfortunate thing with Edison was the fact that, yes, he invented the phonograph.
Hmm.
And so he looked at it like a father being a jealous father over his daughter. He wouldn't allow certain types of music on his phonograph. He said, "My phonograph will not have that." It sounds just like a father saying,
Yeah.
"My daughter is not going out with him."
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Hmm.
He treated it like his child,
So,
and so he was extremely protective, but also very bigoted in his ideas of music.
what was forbidden in Edison's eyes?
Oh God, how much time do you have? I mean, tremolo, room noise, pedal noise, bad tunes, bad singers, disagreeable lyrics, um, Victor sounding type of record. That was a big no-no. He created something called the Victor ear tickle, one of his lesser known inventions. It was on a piece of cardboard like this,
Yeah.
and his right ear was good, his left ear was real bad. And so when he listened to Victor records, he put the cardboard against his ear to get rid of a lot of the high-pitched sounds of Victor records.
Yeah.
And he called that sound a Victor eardrum tickle.
Hmm.
And so this was his invention. And so he would listen to Victor records with a cardboard over his ear. I mean, it's very bizarre stuff.
Yeah. I actually prefer the sound of Victor records to Edison
Oh
records.
yeah, well, Edison's dead. It
Yeah.
was a dead studio.
Hmm.
His idea
Very dead
was that the
studio now.
phonograph would take on the room's ambiance, whatever.
Yeah. Hmm.
But also he picked the music. He picked the artists. He would cancel certain songs. He considered himself a very good musician, which he wasn't.
Hmm.
And he was single-handedly responsible for how badly the Edison record eventually did, because he wouldn't allow certain singers certain types of music. But he would put in songs that he thought were great, but he didn't understand. He didn't understand the business in so many ways.
Well, he was in his
Perhaps his
70s by
huh?
this. He was in his 70s by this stage.
Yeah, but when he started the disc record, he was like 65,
Hmm.
64, 65. And one of his ideas was not to put the name of the singer on the record. If anyone should have understood star power, it should have been him.
Hmm. Well, he had his
Because
own name on the record.
I mean, everything that he did had his name on it.
Yep. And his face and
Right.
yeah.
He understood, but he said singers should not be on the record. He said what people want to hear is the tune. They don't care who the singer is, and that's totally wrong. He couldn't have been more wrong.
Yeah. And he was that I didn't know that, you know. I mean, a lot of the cylinders and records I've seen do have the artist's name on it, but that was
Yes.
thanks to other people in the company, correct?
They eventually convinced Edison that it's good to put a name on the
Hmm.
record. I mean, who's going to buy tenor solo? Who's the tenor?
Hmm.
And the recording factories were getting all confused because they didn't know who the artist was. And they had to make little marks on the record so they could figure out who was what.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an absolute fiasco initially. And then eventually they put the names on, but then he would find something else to basically complain about.
Hmm.
A lot of it was jazz. He hated jazz.
Hmm.
He said it was for degenerates and nuts.
Hmm. Yeah. Did he ever have any jazz on his Edison Records label?
Yes, yes. There was a remarkable amount of jazz. Now, I think in his heart of hearts, he kind of realized that he was old and passé and that this was the new music.
Hmm.
So he made a deal. He would basically judge most of the jazz records and pass maybe a third of them. But then he would have 2 records a month would be made without his interference at all. And those were the really hot jazz records.
Hmm.
And so there's quite a few of them. You know, if you think about it, 2 records a month, that adds up in a year. I mean, that's like 24, recordings.
Hmm. Yeah. So, how about blues? What did you think of blues music?
Not much.
Yeah. Hmm.
You will see when you look at his comments that he's just spitting into the wind. And he says jazz music's good when the jazz music's good. I mean, that means nothing.
Hmm.
It was basically his interpretation. It's sort of like, okay, let's say I'm in my 60s. If I had to judge new music now, rap, let's say, I'd be like going, "Oh my God, this is," I would say rotten, not good, but that's not that's what the people want to hear.
Hmm.
That's the mistake that Edison
I'm
made.
16 and I fully agree with you, but the majority of people my age, they
Sure.
think different.
Of course they do. You're an anomaly.
Hmm.
Cherish that, okay?
I will.
Yeah, because you are, think about this. You have this vast swamp of everybody thinking the same way.
Yeah.
And you're walking in a different direction. So
Hmm.
that's a great thing.
Yeah, it's not easy though. Going against the
No,
grain.
never is.
And as I'm sure you know.
Oh, I know very well. I've been fighting it, for 50 some
Mm.
odd years. But I have never, ever given up. And I'm as optimistic now as I was when I was 16.
Mm. Yep.
That's the important thing. You never lose your optimism
Mm.
because if you think about it, optimism can turn one man into an army.
Hmm. Yeah. It's a bit hard to be optimistic over here. Do you know how much it costs to get like a Victor 78 RPM? Let's say Henry
I
Burr.
have, I have, I have no idea.
It's about 50 to 60 Australian dollars. So that's maybe $30 in USD. So
That's incredibly stupid.
or Billy,
Jeez.
it's all shipping. It's all
Yeah,
shipping.
I understand the shipping. I saw so much stuff like in like England and whatever that would be great, and it was not that expensive, but the shipping was like insane.
Yeah. I think it's overinflated for sure. I think I'm gonna it is a dream of mine personally to move to the US, and I think that would be getting the records, that would be more convenient to say the least.
Let me ask you a question. At the age of 16,
Yeah.
what do you want to do? What are your ideas for your future?
Well, I want to sing. I want to be a professional singer.
Are you by listening to you speak, I'm thinking that you're like a lyric baritone.
Um, yeah, in a way, and I also sing in a tenor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, lyric baritone would be like what we'd call a tenor two.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's more or less where your voice is, kind of like what I hear.
Mm.
But still, your voice is still developing. Takes a long time for the voice to develop. Doesn't really reach development until you're about 30 or so.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It gets
But
deeper and all over the place.
so if you're coming to the United States, make sure we know and look us up. Well,
Yep.
make sure you have lots of Billy Murray records.
They're quite easy to find, aren't they, in the US? If you know where you're.
Oh, they're all over the place.
Yeah. Where do you look?
Well, I don't really get much in the way of records much anymore.
Or where did you
Every
look?
once in a while, I'm going to go to the phonograph show in Wayne, which will be in April, and I'll maybe buy two or three records or something like that, and a
Yeah.
couple of cylinders. I think we do buy lots and lots and lots of records when we're younger. And it
Hmm.
doesn't really matter what the record is. It's an old record and we have piles of the things all sitting around.
Hmm.
I was giving them away. I gave away probably about 800 records.
Oh,
When I moved to Chicago here, I had to downsize. So
yeah.
I downsized my library of books and my records. So I found a lot of young collectors and said, here's a care package. Get started. There you go.
Yeah. That was nice of you to do that.
Well, it's good to do that. You want to encourage people.
Yeah.
Some of the worst things I've ever seen are the people that want to have this and they said, this is a rare record, it's mine, and they hoard the stuff.
Hmm.
Why?
Well,
Take it. I like to look at this is for fishing. You sit there and say, let's find somebody who's interested in early music
hmm.
and encourage it.
Yeah.
And then these people will continue this hobby.
Yep. You're
You
right.
you don't want to, you don't want to, you don't want to, you don't want to thwart that. You want to push that as much as you can.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
always been my feeling. I've always tried to do that with people
Hmm. That's very
and
nice.
will continue to do.
Yeah. Yeah, well, if I had a hat on, I'd take it off because for you, because I think what you're doing is just great, but I'll give you a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
It's been great having you on the show.
Yeah, it's good talking to you. I
Is there
think we
anything
can
else you'd like to
talk
say?
about a lot more stuff too in the future.
Yeah, if you ever want to come on the show again, or if you just want to talk, I'd be more than happy to. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap it up?
Well, I'd like to congratulate you on what you're doing.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful thing to see. Um, Once again, when I was your age, there was no one I could talk to.
Mm.
You have the entire world you can talk to. Take the talent you have, take the passions you have, and focus them on the world.
Mm.
That's what you need to do.
Yeah.
And people will come knocking at your door. That's electronically, I should say.
Yeah. Thanks for
You know,
yeah.
sure.
Yeah, you've given a lot of good advice and you've told me a lot of stuff I didn't know and I think the people listening to my podcast will find it quite interesting.
Well, hello to all the people in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to be here and nice to talk to you all and take a look at this fella, support him, and watch what he does. That's important.
Thank you, Jack.
Okay.
Thank you very
So we'll talk soon then, I guess.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you.
Okay. Likewise.
Yeah.
Best
Thank you.
wishes to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
And that was my interview with Mr. Jack Stanley. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you don't mind, please like and follow my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Tom Venam Music. That's Tom Venam Music for all of them. And I'll see you in the next video. And take care, everyone, and God bless.